It's a more contained version of it, although it's not explicitly articulated, but it evokes that. But then when Jef talks about freedom of mobility, creating a space, it shifts the scales in which citizenship is held or not held. So there's a shift there. And when then obviously Paul and Paul is talking about the European Union politics, it participates in that, and Mike's conception of the cosmopolitan democracy. So these sort of tensions that are already inherent in the concept that it evokes, even if we don't intend them. Now, I'm not going to say anything more, but we do have a few minutes for you to participate in the discussion, and if you have any questions. And I think I'm supposed to check the webcast also to see if there is any in the outer world who are interested in these issues and may want to pose questions. Are there any interventions, questions, commentary from the audience? And it would be very helpful if you could identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Zoe Soujon. I'm from LSE, and I wanted to thank the panel. I thought it was very, very interesting, and I have a number of questions, but I'll just start with one. And I guess that's for John Clarke. He talked about some of the motivation for this, about the move to sort of an individualistic model, and how this sort of individualistic model might be part of the collapse of citizenship. And I just sort of wanted you to reflect on how that related to your research, what you found for the collapse of citizenship there, or that threat. Mm-hmm. And I'd welcome any comments from anyone else in their research in that regard. Thank you.
What I suggest is, if there are more questions, to take a whole bunch of them. I noticed that John studiously took notes. He won't forget the question. Are there other questions or interventions? Tony?
I guess my question is prompted by thoughts about some of the differences between what Margie was saying, or what I thought she was saying, and what John was saying, and an overall a sense of an overall discrepancy. The kind of thing that they had in mind was Margie talking about the multiplication of contexts in which government and members of the public are brought together to deliberate upon questions of citizenship, or to be involved or held or called into being as a citizen in some way. And yet, John, the notion of the citizen-consumer pulls in a slightly different direction. That's about, as it were, government trying to manage the interface between government and the public by de-citizenizing, if you like. So it's a comment about that. Are there a number of different ways, different directions in which the interface between governance and, whatever is operating? But then the second question relates to your finding, John, that yours and the other people involved in that study, that very few people identify as citizens. Compare that, on the one hand, then, with the multiplication of the concern in citizenship in the academic world. Kind of like what's going on there? And that's a general question. Why is there the multiplication of that concern within, the kind of theoretical discourses around governance, etc., but that doesn't seem to be getting through to the citizens? And I think that entrepreneur is a very good name for users of the health service, because a good degree of risk is involved, isn't it?
I hate using these. Okay, mine was this. Sorry, Shona Hunter from Leeds University.
Thanks.
So my question is for everybody, I think, or whoever wants to take it up, but was prompted by something that Paul was saying, and it was around, I was fascinated by this notion of the unsavoury, who brings in the unsavoury, and you were talking around, obviously, the European Union, but so I was kind of thinking about, we often think about maybe unsavoury citizens or what have you, and they might get constructed, so who gets constructed as unsavoury, and what happens when we start thinking about nations, nation-states, if that's even kind of relevant, or, on those different levels, if that makes sense. Big question. Right.
Thank you. I think we have 3 questions, and maybe we can just start with John. One was directly addressed to him, and then I'll ask the panel to just reflect on those 3.
I guess my response connects those questions with Tony's, which is about what's happening. Certainly, among the people we talk to, there is no strong sense of collapsing collective identification. That may not be the same as collapsing citizenship, because very few people talked about it. People talked about themselves as being members of the public, or members of a local community, or having a particular sort of service relationship, rather than...
This is the outer world I was mentioning earlier.
They're going to beam down any second.
No, it was a message. I decoded it.
Talent, pure talent. And so I guess it goes to closer to Tony's question, which is that I think, the first question anyway, which is that I think there is both, as it were, a proliferation of talk about citizenship in political terms, which may or may not correspond to lived, inhabited practices and identifications. And I'm being hesitant, which is rare for me, I know, but because our study was so specific, it was about people's relation to public services. It wasn't about did they think of themselves as citizens in general. But I think there's something more generally fascinating about the hyperactivity around citizenship in governmental terms. It goes back to the conversation that Margie reported about New Labour likes its citizens busy, and it likes lots of them. You know, there's all sorts of citizens being evoked regularly, and even the citizen as consumer is still, John Reed tells us, we can be both citizens and consumers, and entrepreneurs and. But that does leave me puzzling about your second question, which is the academic fascination seems to me to track very closely the governmental and political fascination. And I'm not sure that we do quite enough about knowing how inhabited and embedded the hyperactivity might be. Give me more money is the conclusion to this. This might, of course, be talking Engin out of a job title, but I wish to be careful.
Refers to a couple of the questions, perhaps more specifically to Tony, this potential contrast or contradiction between the kind of de-citizenizing consumer orientation on the one side and the desirability of good citizens, New Labour talk of citizenship and so on. If you look at the whole range of initiatives, and as was the multiplicity of sightings of citizenship, the Department of Constitutional Affairs involved in our Good Citizen seminars recently came along, and they have the 21st Century Citizen project, and they are launching this next week, and it's a very grand vision of what government and governance institutions may do over the coming years, possibly decades, to promote good citizenship. And it contains many, many confusing, potentially contradictory strands. But one thing about it was that they are looking for moderately, not too, but moderately active, certainly busy, perhaps rather than active, citizens. And the way in which they've constructed visions of citizenship leaves would-be citizens, ordinary folk, as it were, out of the picture. They remain rather passive in the whole way that they've gone about putting this together. And perhaps the contradiction begins to look less of a contradiction, though not a particularly happy picture, if you look at that. The ways that the forums, the sites, which are apparently, on the face of it, opened up for new forms of citizen activity are themselves constrained and controlled in various interesting ways, so that a certain type of subject might emerge. This is to look at the dark side of it. But if there's something in that dark side, as it were, is it so different from kind of consumer identity being stressed, choice being stressed, the capacity to make choice being stressed? Perhaps not. Perhaps the line between the black and the white that seem to make the contradiction begin to blur into a shade of grey when you see the relatively controlled and constrained nature of some of the, as it were, citizenship and participation initiatives, some of which Nick Marney, sitting in front of me there, our PhD student, is currently working on.